If you've ever heard an urban myth about a man living inside the walls of another family's home, you were actually hearing a story that is rooted in a great deal of truth. In 1986, Daniel Laplante terrorized the Andrews family of Townsend, Massachusetts by making noises from inside their walls and moving things around the house. While this is the best known part of Laplante's story, it is in fact only the beginning. The entire truth is much more disturbing. Welcome to the Fact and Suspicion podcast. I'm your host, Dan.
And I'm your other host, Ben.
And tonight we are discussing the case of Daniel Laplante.
So, we've discussed some pretty horrific cases, but there is something particularly unsettling about this one. I mean, there is stalker levels of crazy, and then there's living inside of someone's walls.
Yeah, this was, I would call it one of the most disturbing cases I know about, just because of the lengths that Laplante went to. I mean, it's hard to say that because he's not, a prolific murderer or something like that.
Right.
But he did some weird stuff.
There's just a creepiness factor to this one that I think some of the other cases we've looked at lack, even if they're more horrific.
He did some horrific things too. I'm just saying he didn't do as much on the level of like Gacy or Bundy or someone like that.
Right.
Or even Israel Keys, but no. But there was a lot going on with Laplante. I mean, he was a very disturbed individual. I think you would assume that from the things he did, but I think it's important to look into his past and what he'd gone through to kind of cause all this. He was born in 1970, and from an early age, he was abused by his father. And from what I can understand, he was abused physically, emotionally, and sexually by his father. And then later on, his stepfather physically abused him. And when he was in high school, he actually started seeing a counselor to get some therapy. And his therapist, according to Laplante, sexually abused him for a year.
Wow. He was sexually abused by his counselor?
Yeah.
So the one person in his life that was supposed to be helping him outside of his awful home life was sexually assaulting him.
Yeah, exactly. So this is someone that, I mean, he had a terrible past and he had a lot of emotional issues that he had no idea how to deal with. And I'm not saying that in any way justifies anything he did.
But it could help to explain it.
Exactly, right? It shows, that this is definitely shows how someone like this can be created, right?
Right. I mean, an environment like that would have to be a recipe for horrific acts.
Yeah, it was. And like I said, it was a terrible home life. He didn't do well socially in school. He really didn't have many friends. He also had poor hygiene, from what I understand. Sometimes he smelled bad. His hair was always greasy. And he had trouble in school as well. He was dyslexic, and he wasn't really getting any support for that at school. So he was having a lot of trouble keeping up academically as well. So nothing was going well in his life.
Did he come from poverty?
Yeah, his family was poor. I don't know if they were, at what level of poverty they were in.
Right.
But they were not, they were not living comfortably. So when he was 15 or 16, Daniel actually started breaking into people's houses in his neighborhood. And he would, steal a few things, but he also did stuff like he would move things around the house just to kind of mess with people's minds. He would pour himself a drink and drink part of it and leave it on the counter. He wasn't covering up any tracks. He wanted people to know that, he'd been there.
Was there any sexual element to it?
Honestly, we don't know for sure at that point. Later on, we do know there were some sexual elements to things, but at this point, we don't know really. Later on, they were able to determine that he, did secrete some semen on the premises, some of his crimes, but we don't know at this point.
Okay.
Now, famously or infamously, he terrorized the Andrews family, right? So we talked about Laplante's background a bit, but then you have the Andrews family. You've got Brian Andrews and his two daughters. They live in Townsend, Massachusetts. It's 1986. And Brian's wife has recently passed away from cancer. And, his daughters aren't doing very well with that. The whole family's having trouble coping with their mother's death, their mother and
Understandable.
wife's death. Yeah. And Annie starts to get calls from some boy she didn't know named Daniel Laplante. He told her that he got her number from a mutual friend and just wanted to contact her. But really, police suspect now that the Andrews home was one of the houses he'd actually broken into, and maybe he found a picture of Annie and got sort of obsessed with her, and did some digging, found their phone number, and started to call and talk to her.
But at this point, he wasn't making any attempt to cover his identity. I mean, he actually introduced himself.
Yeah, no, he did. He was interested in her, right? And they talked on the phone for a while, and he actually asked her out on a date, and she agreed. But the thing is, he had described himself as tall and blonde and good looking, right?
Ah, so fake Tinder profiles before Tinder, huh?
Yeah, exactly, right. But actually, he's not any of these things. He's sort of short, average height. He's got dark, greasy hair, bad hygiene, acne. So when she meets him for the date, she already doesn't really like that.
Yeah, understandable.
And she felt kind of uneasy about it, but she still went on with the date, right?
I mean, it's hard to tell someone that they look like a hideous troll and this isn't happening.
Yeah. Well, so as the date progressed that night, Daniel found out that Annie's mother had recently died of cancer, and he sort of became a little obsessed with that fact. And he kept asking questions about her illness and how much she suffered and, the grief that Annie had been through and everything like that.
Like he seemed to enjoy it, like had some sort of unhealthy fixation on it.
Exactly. Yeah. And so Annie left the date at that point. From what I understand, she said that she wasn't very rude about it. She just sort of said she had to get back home, but she did make it clear that she didn't want to see him anymore. Right.
Seems
So
reasonable given the circumstances.
I had mentioned earlier that the girls were not dealing very well with their mother's passing. And one night, shortly after the date with Daniel, they decided to have a seance to try to contact the mother's spirit. And when they did, they started hearing knocking, tapping from the walls. And initially, they thought that it was their mother trying to contact them.
Right. How old were they at the time?
Annie was 15 and Jessica was 8.
Okay.
So they think it's their mother, but this sort of progresses and the tapping just gets, worse and worse over the following days, and it's keeping them up at nights. And they start seeing things move around the house. And at this point, they think that instead of, contacting their mother, they've contacted some sort of evil
Demon
spirit,
or something.
right? And they tell their dad about it. Their dad doesn't really believe them that all this is going on. He thinks this is just another aspect of them not dealing well with their mother's passing. He thinks maybe they're just projecting all of this and needing attention, needing help.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I can understand why he would think that.
And exactly what would you think, right?
I mean, it's certainly more plausible than an evil spirit.
Exactly. Who would believe in that? He listens, but he doesn't do anything about it. And one afternoon while dad's off at work, the noise is really bad, the tapping, and they hear that it sounds like it's coming from the basement. So the girls decide to be brave and go down to the basement to check it out. And all the articles I read actually say, they take a big kitchen knife with them, even though that's so just like in every horror movie, right?
Right.
But they take a big kitchen knife and they go down to the basement, and written on the wall in the basement, blood red, are the words, "I'm in your room. Come and find me."
Speaking of things that are right out of a horror movie, dear Lord.
Yeah, I wonder how many horror movies are actually sort of based on this. Right?
That's a good question.
And if you're wondering, later on, the police do determine that it was written in ketchup.
Okay.
It wasn't really blood or anything. But the girls are terrified. They run out of the house. They go over to the neighbor's house. They call their dad, tell him to come home. He comes back, and he still thinks that this is the girls doing all of this, as a cry for help. And he says, "I'm going to get you into therapy. We're going to take care of this. And the girls, they're like, Dad, this is real. And he thinks it's just a cry for help, right?
And then he comes home and sees the ketchup on the walls.
No, he thinks they actually wrote it.
Oh, okay, I see.
At all of this, so things go back to, I hate to say normal, but they go back to the regular pace of things.
God, that's
the
horrible,
moving
man.
things around the house, the tapping. I don't know how the girls stood it because they had to be terrified, right?
Right. I mean, hell, I'm not a 12-year-old girl, and that would terrify me. And then to have their father not believe them, I can't imagine what those girls were going through. I mean, that would be horrible.
I would be terrified myself. But the things are still happening. Things are being moved around the house, the tapping on the walls. The girls are losing their minds because the tapping is keeping them up all night. It just keeps tapping, right? So another evening, the dad's at work. The same sort of thing happens, except this time the girls hear the sound coming from upstairs around Annie's room. So they do the same thing. They try to be brave. They get their kitchen knife. They go upstairs. And when they get up there, there's another message on the wall next to Annie's door. And it says, I'm back. Find me if you can. So just like last time, the girls run out of the house. They go to their neighbor's house. They call their dad to come home. And he still thinks his girls are just imagining all this, creating this in their own minds. Because he knows the house isn't haunted. But he says, I'm going to go check all this out. He goes in the house and stuff's really moved around a lot. He really gets the sense that the girls are not lying once he goes in the house this time.
It's about time.
So he goes upstairs to Annie's room to check on everything. When he goes in the room, the first thing he sees, I should say that some of these details differ depending on the article because this particular story has become so infamous and so big in the telling, you get different details. Now, some details say that this message that I'm about to tell you about, he saw in the living room when he walked in, but most articles will say it was on the wall in Annie's room. He goes in, and on the wall in blood red, he sees a message that says, marry me. And when he looks around in the room, that's not the only thing that's there. There is Daniel Laplante over in the corner. He's wearing one of their mother's dresses, makeup, and a blonde wig, and he's holding a hatchet.
I mean, that is next level creepy.
It really is.
I mean, I don't even know what I'm supposed to say to that.
A lot of people think that he was dressed as the mother, and they don't know if he was planning to kill the girls or just to make them think that it was the ghost of their mother and keep terrifying them.
That's certainly what it sounds like. Like he seemed like he really got off on terrorizing them and making them think they were going crazy.
Exactly. But, the dad walks in there. So apparently the two have a struggle, and the dad gets away, and, the cops finally show up. They go in and they search the house, and there's a cupboard built into the wall of Annie's room, and there's a crawl space behind it, and they look at that crawl space, and there is 16-year-old Daniel Laplante. And they find a sleeping bag in there and, like, some garbage of stuff he's been eating. There's empty beer cans.
Oh.
And, one of the cops actually says, he could have been there for a month, but we don't know that he was actually there for that long. We don't know that he was there the whole time. That's something that people say, is he was living in there for 2 months, right? But
it
we
may
can't
not have
actually
been consecutive.
It may have been consecutive. He may have been in there off and on, and it may not have actually been 2 months. We don't know exactly when it started because Annie doesn't remember the exact date, right?
So that was just some sort of offhand comment made by one of the officers?
Right. It could have just been a couple weeks, off and on.
I mean, does it really matter? I mean, any length of time living in someone's walls, doing the things he was doing, I mean...
It's still absolutely insane. I just thought I should point that out, right? We don't know that he actually lived in the walls for 2 months straight. He was probably still off doing some random burglaries and, doing something to make money to buy his beer and whatnot, right?
Right.
But anyway, they find him there, and they put him into a juvenile facility, and this is where things get kind of strange. They're able to hold him in a juvenile facility. This is where things
get strange?
Well, I shouldn't say strange. It's not strange. It's just things go a bit awry here. Because they're holding him in a juvenile facility because obviously this kid's troubled, right?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair statement.
Because of the seriousness of some of his crimes, he's broken into several houses and stolen things. And then the way he terrorized this family, they want to try him as an adult. So in October of 1987 is when they determined that they will try him as an adult.
Well, he was 17 at the time?
He was 16 at the time.
16.
He was still 16. But they decided to try him as an adult. And this causes a strange problem here because they were able to hold him in a juvenile facility, but when he is going to be tried as an adult, they have to allow him to post bail, which he did.
Ah, I see.
So he got out.
That doesn't sound good.
No, this is the worst thing that could have happened. Because he gets out in October. In November, he breaks into another neighbor's home and he steals 2 handguns.
I don't like where this is going.
No, you don't. December 1st, he goes to the Gustafson house, which is about a half mile from his own house. And he murders Priscilla, who is the mother. She's a teacher and she's actually pregnant at the time. He rapes and murders her. And he murders her 2 children as well. It's 7-year-old Abigail and 5-year-old William.
Oh.
It's just heartbreaking that this happened because, obviously authorities knew that he was troubled and a bit dangerous, but they had to allow him to post bail.
Right.
And then this happened, right?
Did he know Priscilla? Was she his teacher?
No, she actually was from what I read, it was sort of a church nursery school.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think she was ever his teacher. He may have known her just from around the neighborhood.
Right.
But, her husband was at work. So he probably knew that the husband was away and he had an opportunity to do this.
But he didn't have any particular connection to her?
No particular connection. And then he actually stole some things from their home as well. He took a cable box and a cordless telephone, which is kind of a thing that he has taken from other houses. So immediately police think, for one, because of the things he just did at the Andrews home and got out of jail, that automatically makes him a suspect, right?
Right.
But also because he stole a couple things, he's been doing stuff like that around town anyway, right? So they automatically think that he is definitely a suspect in this case.
Yeah, I mean, no question.
So the murder took place on December 1st. On the 2nd, they find him at the public library and question him about it. And he denied, any involvement in it, right? Obviously.
Yeah, of course.
Well, later that day, they decide to go to his home to ask a few more questions. And when they're walking up to his house, he's on the front porch. He sees them and he runs into the woods. And, obviously at that point, police are pretty sure he committed the murder. So he's got something to hide.
Right. Why else run?
Right. So they're able to get a search warrant at this point, and they find some really hard evidence that I'll get into in just a few minutes. But while he's on the run, he runs out in the woods and he runs. He actually abducts a woman at gunpoint and forces her to drive him in her Volkswagen van, try to get out of town, I guess, right? And he was probably going to murder this woman as well, but she managed to get away from him. But he still had her van, so he was still driving the van, and they don't know exactly where he is. But they are able to find him the next day on December 3rd. They found him in a dumpster at a lumber yard. And
you know how far away that was? Like how far he'd gotten?
He was still in town. So apparently he wasn't trying to go too far.
Did they have the roads closed down or something? I mean, were they actively looking for him at this point?
Oh, they were very actively looking for him. So he probably wasn't able to get through roadblocks and stuff. Right. But the police actually reported that he was laughing when they arrested him, just like this maniacal laugh.
I mean, that is consistent with the insanity we've heard thus far. So,
but I should, discuss a bit of the evidence because they had this case pretty well wrapped up. He murdered Priscilla with a .22 caliber handgun, and they found a bullet casing in his home that matched the 2 found at the Gustafson home. The actual gun that Priscilla was murdered with was found on the Laplante property as well. There was an old Jeep in their yard. I think it was just a junk one that no one drove anymore, but it was found in the glove compartment of that Jeep.
Had he stashed it there?
Yeah, assumingly he'd just sort of hidden it there.
Okay.
And that was one of the 2 guns that he stole in that break-in in November as well.
Gotcha.
The police also found the cable box that was stolen from the Gustafson house and the cordless telephone at Daniel's house. And one of Daniel's fingerprints was on the cordless phone. They also found a sock at Daniel Laplante's house, and it had saliva on it, and they believe that that had been used to gag Priscilla. Another one of Laplante's socks actually had one of Abigail's hairs on it.
So the evidence is stacking up pretty solidly against him.
Oh, it's very solid evidence. And they also did a blood test on Daniel. And even though DNA is just starting out, DNA technology at this point, right? They did determine that he was a type A secretor. And that matched a semen stain that was found at the Gustafson home.
Right. Type A secretor, that's when, doesn't that mean that your blood type can be determined by like bodily fluids?
Yeah, that's exactly what it means. It means they were able to match his blood type from his semen, his type A blood.
Okay.
So yeah, they have a ton of very solid evidence.
I mean, it seems overwhelming at this point.
And he pleads not guilty, but he's found guilty. And he is sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.
Out of curiosity, at his trial, do you know whether or not prosecutors were allowed to bring in evidence of his past crimes, like, the creepiness with the walls, for example?
Well, he was on trial for multiple things, and that was one of them.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, I got you.
So it wasn't just for the murders, as far as I can understand. He had been charged with several things.
All right.
Though I'm not sure how that works. As far as I know, he was only sentenced to 3 life terms, though. I don't think he had any additional time for the other thing.
I mean, it's understandable that the evidence was so overwhelming in the murders that they were going to be able to send him away for life already anyway. So
exactly, they didn't need to try him for anything else, and they had rock solid evidence. So what did that matter?
Right.
That's not the complete end of the story, though. Daniel actually appealed in 1993 on a couple different things. Mostly it was because of the search warrant. His attorney claimed that the search warrant should have never been issued. And there was a little bit of trouble with it because it identified the Laplante home as a single family dwelling. And I've read some trial transcripts, but I cannot figure out exactly why they say it wasn't a single family dwelling. I don't know if another family lived there. I think his adult brother lived there. That may be what they were talking about.
But either way, the goal was to suppress the evidence gained from the search warrant, right?
Exactly. They wanted to get a new trial, but obviously they were denied that just because, according to the judge, the police actually did their due diligence. There was only one driveway. There's only one mailbox. There's only one entrance into the home.
Right.
Right. But for all intents and purposes, it seemed to be a single family dwelling.
I mean, that sounds like the defense was grasping at straws there.
They really seem to be grasping. And, usually when they suppress a search warrant like that, it's either because something illegal happened to obtain the search warrant,
right,
or because something small was wrong and the evidence they found was circumstantial. But in this case, it was very solid evidence they found. And, obviously there's nothing wrong. There's just a little problem with the paperwork, apparently, right?
So trying to use a small technicality in the paperwork to invalidate the horribly incriminating evidence they found against him?
Pretty much, yeah. Okay. Also, his lawyer did bring up the fact that in the first trial, the judge did not instruct the jury that Daniel could have been insane at the time. But his defense attorney at the time was not pursuing an insanity defense.
Then why would he instruct the jury that was a possibility?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, but it's an attempted appeal, right? But he lost his appeal. And there were some other things too. In 2000, he actually requested to be put into protective custody in prison because he felt like he was in danger from the other inmates because of, the
hurting children,
infamous nature of his crimes, and he murdered children and things like that, right?
Right.
So he was put into like sort of a solitary confinement, and then he sued because they were denying him access to the library.
Really?
Yeah. And I think I read he actually won $450 in that settlement.
So he requested to be put in solitary confinement for his own protection and then sued because he couldn't go to the library?
Exactly. Yeah. Then in 2013, there was another issue. Um, he said that he wasn't being allowed to practice his religion in a fitting manner.
What religion
Uh,
was that exactly?
he said he was Wiccan,
Ah,
and he needed to be provided with certain special materials.
what, do you want him to grow him a tree inside of his cell?
I don't know. I don't know what he was expecting, but maybe it's just something to raise a fuss about, right? But then he did have another appeal in 2017, and this was actually kind of interesting because the Supreme Court had recently ruled that juveniles cannot be sentenced to life without parole. So he wanted his sentence to be changed from 3 life sentences to be carried out consecutively to 3 life sentences to be served concurrently. And that would have made him eligible for parole immediately in 2017 instead of in 2032, when he would have had to serve 15 years for each life sentence at that point, and he would be eligible in 2032. But he lost that appeal as well.
Did the
He
law
actually
apply retroactively?
it did, yeah. So no one that had been sentenced as a juvenile to life without parole, they had to become eligible for parole after 15 years of a life sentence.
Okay.
Now he did lose the appeal though. He actually apologized publicly during that appeal, and a lot of people say that it sounded insincere. And I watched it on YouTube, but I can't say that I feel like it necessarily sounded insincere because, anytime in court when you read a statement, it doesn't sound great, right?
Right.
But I don't know. I'm not saying that it was sincere either. He probably just wants out of jail. Now, the judge pointed out when she denied this appeal that this was not just one crime that caused 3 deaths. He committed 3 individual murders at this point. So she felt that he should have to serve the minimum 15 years for all 3 of them. So she officially resentenced him so that his 3 life sentences would be carried out consecutively, so that he definitely will not be eligible for parole until 2032.
So was that the end of his appeals that you know of?
Yeah, that's the end of everything to date.
And when will he be eligible for parole?
In 2032, so 11 years.
And how long has he been in prison now?
He's been in prison for 34 years at this point.
Well, hopefully he'll stay there. In general, I don't particularly care for the notion of juveniles being sentenced for life, but he killed 3 people. And considering the creepy things he did before, I mean, it's probably best if this guy never gets out of prison.
I completely agree. I also agree about juveniles not being sentenced to life, but you have different circumstances, right? A lot of times, when that happens to a young person like that, they did something stupid. Maybe, they were trying to rob a store or something and accidentally shot someone, something like that.
Right.
And, while that's still, like, I don't want to defend their actions, it was just like a dumb thing they did. This was someone that did something very deliberate.
Yeah, the crime you're talking about, that seems like something you could be rehabilitated for, though, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I don't know where you would begin a rehabilitation process for someone like Daniel Laplante.
No, and I don't think you really can. I know you and I talk a lot about how our criminal justice system should function in a way more that helps people be rehabilitated.
Right.
But it also needs to function in a way that someone that is this dangerous, we're protected from them
Right.
as well.
I mean, that has to be that has to be the primary function, protecting society. I mean, rehabilitation has to be a secondary goal, and only for those people who can be rehabilitated.
Right. And with someone like this that, you have him just terrorizing a family, and not just that one family, these other people's houses he broke into, he would just move things around and stuff just to mess with them.
Right. Like, his behavior is so far outside of the norm that it just seems like, I mean, a rehabilitation program would be wasted on him. I would never feel safe with someone like Daniel Laplante walking around free.
No, I wouldn't either. And imagine the Andrews family, right? I'm not sure, where they are now, what they're doing, if the dad's still alive at this point. But, Annie especially, if he could find her when he was released, I would be terrified if I was Annie.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I have issues with the type of retributive justice system that we have, but I mean, this is not one of the cases that bothers me, right? I won't be losing any sleep over Daniel LaPlante rotting in prison.
No, it honestly bothers me that someone like this will be eligible for parole.
I doubt he'll get it. And hopefully, one of his victims or a family member will be there to ensure he stays where he belongs.
Right. I hope so. Also with the fact that so many people felt that he was so insincere in his apology in 2017, if he can't improve on that, I don't think anyone's going to grant him parole.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to agree. So is that pretty much it for the Daniel LaPlante case? I mean, is there? You said as far as you know, that's all for his appeal history. Anything else notable?
No, nothing else really notable in this one. I've looked for news articles and I can't find any other news articles about any appeals past that 2017 appeal.
All right. Well, I guess we'll just leave it there then.
While this case is particularly intriguing, it's important to remember that 3 innocent people were murdered. Even though LaPlante is likely still a danger to society, I don't disagree that juveniles shouldn't be sentenced to life without parole. Our criminal justice system should work to rehabilitate, especially in the case of young offenders. LaPlante was a very troubled young man who had suffered a great deal of trauma, but this absolutely does not erase his horrendous actions. And I'm concerned that if he is paroled in 2032, that he may indeed kill again.